afternoon, and thanks for stopping by Across the Fence. I'm Keith Silva. Like the sparrows returning to Capistrano, where the sun, rising in the east and setting in the west, to no one's surprise, Vermont sugarmakers led the nation in maple syrup production in 2025. All kidding aside, this annual show of Vermont's consistency in the marketplace and the sugar house is a testament to Vermont sugarmakers and the state's maple industry. Today we're going to talk about these latest numbers and learn how it all sugars off in quantity and quality of maple syrup produced in Vermont. To talk about Vermont's domination in the industry, I'm joined by UVM Extension Maple Specialist Mark Isselhardt. Mark, thanks for coming in.
Glad to be back.
Great. My sarcasm aside, my apologies to you. It's not meant than anything but tongue-in-cheek. What stands out in these findings for you?
Well, for one, it was a big number. So over 3 million gallons of syrup were produced by Vermont sugarmakers in 2025, just slightly below last year, which was also a big crop. So consistency is a big one. Mm-hmm. There's always, it's a agricultural product, and weather plays a huge role. And so you never really know going in what it's going to be. So having a solid number as far as the crop is important to meet markets. It's also a recognition that producers are doing good work. They're consistently producing a high volume of syrup. Their yields are good, and that means they're employing modern technologies and really being diligent about leak checking and really focusing their attention on making sure they're prepared for that really narrow window of sap flow.
The numbers are compiled by NASS, the National Agricultural Statistics Service. This is through the USDA?
Yeah.
How are those numbers compiled?
So every year there's a voluntary survey that producers get. Mm-hmm. NASS, as you said, is part of the USDA, and they send out surveys to sugar makers they know of. Now, if they don't know you exist, you don't get a survey. You would have to make them aware that you exist and go to the website and register, and not everyone does that. But they are the holders of production data over the long haul. And so they ask questions about production, quality. We've started hearing, they're starting to collect data on acreage. I was pleased to be part of a working group who worked directly with NASS to simplify the survey. For a long time, it was about a 4-page survey. It required producers to do weighted averages about different things. And we found participation kind of waning. The industry recognized that as an issue, and so we worked directly with NASS along with other Vermont producers and folks from elsewhere to trim it down to 2 pages. It's much more simplified. So every year that data comes out. Every 5 years, there's called the Ag Census. This is a more involved, more detailed survey, and that gives us an even more precise look at where the industry is at.
So a lot of times when we do this show yearly, I'm happy to say, because there's always big numbers to report, you always talk about underreporting. So this is an example of, look, if they don't know you started your sugar business, the numbers are bigger than they actually appear.
When we talk to the majority of the people who move the crop, these are the packers or processors of syrup, the vast majority of Vermont's crop goes in a barrel and is then sold to another business that we call packers. Mm-hmm. It's 85% of the crop at this point. Right. And so they have an idea of what Vermont producers are producing every year, and they see it as about a 35% underreporting in terms of the USDA numbers. Now that seems like a lot, especially a big production state like Vermont, but it does capture trends. And so I don't want to discount the work that NASS does. I think it is really valuable, especially over time, but we need to have more accurate numbers. The industry is larger, people are working hard to produce that syrup, and it deserves to be reflected in the statistics.
But if all those little sugar makers are sending their syrup to one of these packers, then that's how you can sort of look at the numbers and say, yeah, okay, maybe this isn't, number of sugar makers, but the numbers are accurate. We're not, like you said, not discounting anything.
Right, yeah. Unofficially, we think it's about a 35% under.
Does anyone else keep track of maple stats in the state or regionally?
So there are some bits of data. The Vermont Agency of Agriculture has some data on the folks who purchase syrup, those processors, packers. Yep. But and the Sugar Makers Association, membership, they have some data, not so much on production so much, just as numbers of operations. The other important thing to remember is the vast majority of the crop is certified organic. So 2/3 of the Vermont crop is certified organic. The certifiers, in large case Vermont organic farmers, they have data on number of producers and taps, but they're not sharing that necessarily. That's private, and the producers themselves would have to give permission to share that.
Right. And we're sort of burying the lead here slightly. There was a slight increase in the amount of syrup that was made this past in 2025.
It was actually just a little bit below 2024, but within less than 1% or so. And that's a big number. That's 3 million gallons of syrup. The next closest state that produces syrup would be New York, and they're at about a little under 900,000 gallons. So quite a bit less.
Big difference.
And there's lots of reasons for that. I would say the number one reason is people willing to do the hard work and get out there during a, admittedly not ideal time to be in the woods. And so you have the know-how, you have the willingness, and you have the resource. We have trees. We have a high percentage of trees growing that are maples. You combine that with a reasonable amount of ideal weather, and you see Vermont leading the way. Incidentally, if Franklin County was a state and not just a county, it would be the number 2 producing state in the country. Over 1 million gallons of syrup just comes out of Franklin County itself.
Franklin County, its own state. I'll leave that one out there to everyone there. You've had a hand in researching syrup testing. How is your work contributing to these national statistics?
Yeah, so syrup production is very important, but syrup quality is also important. The average consumer has no real connection to the producer. Their interaction with maple syrup is just buying it off the shelf and tasting it. If there's an issue with quality, it affects the entire industry. So quality matters if you're a small scale hobbyist selling a few pints or the largest operation in the state making, hundreds of thousands of gallons of syrup. So we need to know what's out there. The state of Vermont does retail testing in the marketplace through the Agency of Agriculture. At UVM Extension, we've also done retail testing to see does it meet the minimum. And what we find is not all the syrup that's out there in the marketplace measures up. And it's really important to share that information with the industry, make sure that folks are doing the basics right. Using the NASS numbers, self-reporting, producers say roughly 2 to 3% of their crop is processing grade. This is syrup that doesn't meet grade A standards, largely because of flavor, but it could be other defects. When we actually look at the data in the marketplace, we see it's closer to 20 to 25%. So there's a disconnect there, and what I would hope is that some of the work we do on educating around quality, the basics, how to grade syrup and how to identify issues is going to help bring the real number down so that more of the syrup that reaches consumers is that grade A quality. Not to say that syrup that doesn't meet grade A standards doesn't have value. It gets used in all kinds of products, granolas and beef jerky and all sorts of things. It just can't go in a retail package labeled as grade A.
And to reinforce that, the idea here is that you're the consumer, you go to the store, it should be any maple syrup container you pull off the shelf is consistent with every other maple syrup container anywhere that has the Vermont name on it. That's what we're talking about.
There's going to be variability for sure, but they have to meet the minimum in both color, clarity, flavor, and density. And when it doesn't, then there's an issue. I'm happy to say that we're starting some syrup testing capability at UVM Extension later this year. Producers will be able to send samples in, get them tested in the lab for just those basics, and we'll be able to give some immediate feedback to producers.
You were talking before about, maple syrup sugaring not being done in the most ideal weather conditions. The weather this year was hit or miss depending on where you were in the state, right?
Yeah, there's a saying, if you've seen one sugaring season, you've seen one sugaring season, and there really is a lot of truth to that. This year, as recently we've heard, tapping started early, especially for the largest operations. So at this point, it's pretty common to hear about people starting to tap in December when you have tens of thousands of taps. That's more related to labor constraints than
and the size of the operation.
The size of the operation, exactly. Then we had what a lot of people are calling a traditional Vermont winter. It was cold, the snow piled up, There was no base. It was just bottomless powder. So if you had snowshoes on, it's almost like you didn't have them on. You're sinking into the hips. Then we had this warm up in March, and that was really a break point. Producers in generally warm areas, southerly areas, or maybe in the Champlain Valley, they saw their tap holes stop producing very well. Producers outside of that area, where they're generally colder, when the sugaring weather came back, it really took off. And so we had some people who had their largest runs ever. In fact, at the Sugar Bush at the Proctor Maple Research Center, we had basically a 24-hour period with the single largest run. About 10% of the whole crop came during that one run.
Wow.
Which really highlights the importance of weather, because if something happens to your equipment or something else, you could lose that production. So it's still a knife's edge in a lot of ways.
Yeah, 90% of your crop in essentially 24 hours is
10%.
10% is remarkable. Every year the numbers increase because sugar makers put more taps. We get about a minute left. So next year we'll be back here and we'll just rinse and repeat, and we'll be talking about Vermont's dominance again?
Well, I don't see anyone coming close to meeting where Vermont is in total production anytime soon. I will say there's always going to be variability from year to year. You look at a year like 2012, where we had 5 days in the 70s in March. If something like that were to occur, it's going to be big news across the whole maple belt. I would say that the maple industry continues to grow. Maybe that massive expansion has slowed a bit, but there's still more trees to tap, or maybe in the 5 to 10% of all the potential taps, tappable trees are being tapped. So we know that growth is definitely possible.
As long as Franklin County doesn't defect from Vermont and go to New York, I think we'll be okay. Mark, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking to you about maple. And that takes care of our program today. I want to thank the crew behind the scenes here at WCX who make our program possible. And I'm confident to say there's not a sap among them. This is Across the Fence. I'm Keith Silva. Thanks for being part of our family.